A frontier for social justice, a bold act of change in a history of cruelty. From an egregious event in history to a bold act of change, the Wiyat Massacre of 1860 sparked national awareness and biased experiences by national journalism. This change in journalism caused readers to confront how brutally Native Americans were being treated, not only by the U.S. and state governments, but by common citizens as well. Now there is no denying that Native Americans were being treated horribly and unjust. The brutality of this massacre to a peaceful people became a catalyst for journalistic change, laying a new frontier. Bret Harte wrote from the Wiyot perspective, which had not been done before. The Wiyot were a medium-sized tribe with about 2,000 members that occupied the land around Humboldt Bay. When the first settlers came to the land, the Wiyot did not seem to mind. Major Rains, a commanding officer at Fort Humboldt at the time, described the Wiyot this way: "These Indians were the most inoffensive I ever saw. Killed nobody, and troubled nobody's cattle. Were useful furnishing fish and clams for the whites, often helping them in their domestic concerns, living apart by themselves, orderly, and never drank liquor." When the Wiyot people were attacked on Tuawa Island, they were practicing their 7 to 10 day world renewal ceremony. The purpose of the renewal ceremony can be described by Ted Hernandez.
So the importance for that is it brings balance to the world, for healing, for better hunting, fishing seasons, gathering seasons, and it's to bring the world together as one.
The motive behind the massacre can possibly be linked to a German immigrant by the name of Robert Gunther. Gunther bought the island 3 days before the massacre, claiming that in early 1860 he had seen that the island was for sale, of course without the knowledge of the Wiyot, and bought it, not knowing people were living there.
On the night of February 26, the Wiyot were practicing their annual world renewal ceremony on Tuawa Island. The ceremony at the time mostly comprised of women, children, and elders, while the men were out hunting. Out of nowhere, a group of white settlers from the nearby settlement of Eureka came to the island with hatchets, clubs, and knives, brutally murdering every single person they could find. This group called themselves the Humboldt Volunteers. They mainly consisted of residents from the Eel River Valley and Hydesville. Their main goal was to exterminate all Indian settlements in Humboldt County. We know not much about this group of volunteers because only 2 names are disclosed to the public: Captain Seaman Wright and Lieutenant E.D. Holland. Other than those 2, no others were named. This horrific attack was detrimental to the Wiyot, but was not isolated. The Tuawa massacre was just one out of many planned killings that occurred within a 12-day span. These attacks diminished the population by 90%, decreasing the population from around 2,000 to 200, and today the Wiyot are still in recovery with only about 600 enrolled members. The approximately 200 remaining survivors of these killings were forced onto reservations where they were stripped of their culture, language, and land that they had occupied since time immemorial. Before this point in history, Native Americans had been considered by many whites to be animals not worthy of journalistic coverage. However, in 1860, a writer named Bret Harte provided a new perspective to journalism in his article entitled "Women and Children Butchered." Bret offered the other side on Native Americans as human beings and able to be harmed by others. This work sparked a national awareness of the treatment of Native Americans.
Bret Harte was born in 1836 and moved to the town of Union, now present-day Arcata, in 1854, following his family from New York, where he became an editor for the local newspaper, the Northern Californian. He wrote short stories for the newspaper. Harte witnessed bodies dumped in the Mad River, and he reported what he witnessed. He provided first-hand accounts of infants and children with their faces cloven in with hatchets. This language strongly demonstrates the brutality was a massacre and not just a political decision. There was no strong government in California, specifically Northern California, so massacres like this were not put under investigation to find the perpetrators. It was even said that some generals turned a blind eye to this interaction, even though it was stated later that some of these generals might have known who the perpetrators were. Though some people saw this article as enlightening, others thought the telling of the story was unacceptable. He was threatened and had to leave town. Mr. Hart's courage continued. He left town and published the article in Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Bulletin.
Interestingly, just because these newspapers wanted to run his article did not mean that they agreed that the massacre was completely unjustified. National attention was given to the massacre months after he published his work. But even though it was difficult for society to see the atrocities through the lens of Native Americans, the coverage was unprecedented and sparked national awareness. An example of this is when the San Francisco Bulletin gives additional information suggesting that the motive for the massacre was cattle rustling that the Wiyot took part in. But the reality is that the massacre was fully incited by people who wanted the land for their own purposes, so they made up reasons to justify taking the land. The Humboldt Times, a rival newspaper to the Northern Californian a day before the massacre, wrote this: "The settlers must be protected, and the Indians and not white must yield ground. Keep this company of dragoons stationed at Fort Humboldt until the Redskins are driven from our country." A week after the massacre, or 4 days after Bret Hart's article, the Humboldt Times addressed the massacre but with neutral terms, showing no regret for the article they had published a day before the massacre. And here is an excerpt from that article. "The rancheria on Indian Island was attacked on Saturday night by an unknown party of men. News reached the town that the ranges on South Beach, South Spit, had also been attacked. A considerable number of Indians on the Eel River were also killed at the same time. The whole number killed at different places on Saturday night cannot fall far below 150, including bucks, squaws, and children." A mere 10 days after writing that article on the massacre, they wrote this: "For the past 4 years we have advocated only two alternatives for ridding our country of Indians. Either remove them to some reservation or kill them," showing that not all saw this massacre as unjust. After the massacre, the land was in the ownership of Robert Gunther, and when he died, it went into the ownership of Eureka, as well as some other small properties on the island. In 1970, the WIA asked the Eureka City Council for the land to be returned, but nothing came of it. Ted Hernandez explains what he thinks the reason is.
I think a lot of it has to do with education. We were able to educate the next generation on why the island was important to the Wiyat people and why it was important to the community as well, not just the Wiyat tribe.
Conversations began again in 1992, when the Wiyat, as well as some other non-natives, started holding vigils in the neighboring Woodwee Island to commemorate the lives lost in 1860. In 2000, the Wiyat purchased 1.5 acres of the island, and in 2004, the city handed back 40 acres, but they still kept ownership of the majority of the land. And finally, a delegation led by tribal chairman Ted Hernandez asked once again in 2015 for the remaining acreage. This time, the city agreed, and so a flurry of planning was unleashed. It took 3 years for it to be finally returned in 2019, and Ted explains why.
It was a long process. It took almost 4 years to complete the process. And the reason why it took so long is because we had not just the city attorneys and the city council and the tribal council and the tribal attorneys working together on this project. We just wanted to make sure that we had everything correct so that both sides, the city of Eureka and the tribe, would be happy with the transfer of the island. So we wanted to make sure everything was correctly documented and correctly written. So we took our time to basically work with the city and their attorneys, and we're able to put down what we would like to see what happened to the island and what the island was to be used for.
Marnie Atkins will now explain how the island is now back entirely into the hands of the Wiyat.
Well, I think it's fantastic. But I also know that it took a lot of time and effort to do. We had an initial return of some of the island back to us in the mid 2000s, I think it was around 2005 or something like that. I can't rightly remember.
Yeah, the 2004.
Yeah, there it is. Thank you. And then, so that was a big effort, and we worked hard with the city of Eureka to do that. And then, it took several more years before the final portion of the city land that they held to come home to us back in 2018, right? Yeah. So my perspective is I'm thrilled, I'm happy. That island is very important to us culturally, and it's a sacred place. So to have it back where we can go back and do our ceremonies there is very important.
One very tangible example in the shift in today's local history is present in the recent resignation of Eureka's planning commissioner, due to the shift in minds and opinions of Eurekans, who was forced to step down due to a racist comment towards the Wiyat people at a scheduled meeting. The continued shift in the minds and opinions of locals on this singular event marks a new beginning in that racism will no longer be tolerated towards the Wiyat.